Academic and lawyer Ian Peach has been thinking about and writing about the famous phrase duty to consult. Now, I say famous, but it's really only been this century, the 21st, when that term has been used, starting with court cases. Interestingly, on the same day in 2004, Ian Peach is in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
Well, let's, as they say, unpack that word or define our terms. What is the duty to consult?
Well, the Crown government has a duty to consult when its decisions could have a negative effect on Aboriginal and treaty rights or Aboriginal title, which are now protected in the text of the Constitution in Section 35, rights that are claimed, not necessarily proven yet. And as you say, duty to consult began in 2004 in the case of Haida Nation in British Columbia. I will say as an aside that while I'm not a practicing lawyer these days, so I'm not rendering a legal opinion here, as a matter of respectful intersocietal relations, Haida Nation, I think, is immensely important because the Supreme Court took the idea that Indigenous peoples were and are sovereign as real, tangible, without doubt. And they referred to Crown sovereignty, interestingly, as assumed or asserted, but not proven.
All right, let me, since you are, if I may call you a recovering lawyer, not practicing, let me put that into plain language that the European settlers came here and assumed or asserted a sovereignty that I think you just said the court says may not actually exist.
That's right. The court has been quite inconsistent on this, but in Haida Nation, the court said, in essence, we can't go further than saying it's assumed. It is de facto as an exercise of power, but not de jure, which is as a matter of law. As a matter of law, because Indigenous peoples were on this continent first in organized societies that had law and had sovereignty, and they were never conquered, their sovereignty is real and unequivocal.
Now, for those who like to Google things these days, and it's so easy, unlike when you began in law with perhaps a research assistant and so on, but it's Tlingit, and if I can pronounce it, I'm not sure I can spell it, T-L-I-N-G-I-T, I think, and Haida, and
Yep.
Mikisew later are the short forms of referring to those cases. They do differ a bit. You said something to this effect moments ago. I think in one of them it says if you've created a pathway whereby the Indigenous peoples and groups can voice their opinions, you got it made. And then there's another writing that says you have to actively seek out those opinions. So even the Supreme Court on the same day was not exactly in sync with itself. Have I got that right?
Indeed. The idea that the Crown government has to have some duty to consult with people who may have a right, even before the right is proven, makes a lot of sense. For instance, if the Crown, if the government were to authorize somebody to take resources or take an action that harms the environment or resources without consulting the Indigenous peoples who have a claim about that resource or that territory, about the harm it might do, then by the time the Indigenous peoples get through the court system, not a fast enterprise, and prove that they have a right, the right may no longer have any value. So, there's a basic rule of law, basic rule of justice, that you can't destroy something that is actually somebody else's thing. So it makes sense. But unfortunately, because the Crown's duty to consult has been constructed as a legal duty, governments have tended to think, okay, what do we have to do to meet the court's requirement? and do as little as possible to do that, rather than thinking about what's the proper thing to do for respectful intersocietal relations.
Now, I think you made an important point, at least to a layperson, and that is you can't wreck somebody's belongings while you're in the process of determining ownership. There's also a piece of trivia from English law. You don't have to prove ownership in order to prosecute someone for theft. And someone was indeed prosecuted for stealing a teddy bear from the sidewalk outside Kensington Palace when Lady Diana died. No need to prove who owned it. It was just theft from whomever. Is that the similar principle?
Indeed. What you need to know, or what has to happen for something to be a theft, is that the person who takes it needs to know that they don't own it. And who does, doesn't matter.
Now, let's put consultations into a broader context, if you don't mind. I think it's fair to say the duty to consult is a very special duty. It is backed up by the honor of the crown. And for those who say, oh, that's ancient history, the monarchy and so on and so forth. But that's who the Indigenous people had their deal with in 1763 with the Royal Proclamation and with treaties. It was with the crown. It wasn't with a thing called Canada, because it didn't exist. Well, with that filibuster, let me finalize by saying we have a history of horrible consultations with everybody. William H. Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon, once said, well, the public be damned, when he was asked the effect on the public of his closing down a railroad. What's good for America is good for General Motors. The business of America is business. It's really only in our living memory from the egalitarian 60s that anybody consulted with anybody, now mandated in the Municipal Act, the Planning Act, but it's often kind of a show consultation. It really doesn't seek, let alone implement, public input, wouldn't you say?
I would agree. I mean, what's happened is, because governments are looking at how little they can get away with, basically. The idea of a duty to consult Indigenous peoples is a moving target, right? Government does too little. The Indigenous peoples challenge it in court, and the courts add some content to the duty to require governments to do more, to take it more seriously. But it's been a constant cycle over the last 15 years. We need to move off that legalistic idea and move into a new phase of essentially intergovernmental arrangements of mutual respect. I do think the next phase might be upon us.
Now, I have exhibits, as you lawyers like to call them. This is your academic piece, and it talks about the duty to consult. But later, a federal government document on how to consult is entitled Aboriginal Consultation and Accommodation. And some academic pieces are talking about the duty to consult and accommodate. Yet original Supreme Court cases said the duty to consult doesn't mean a duty to agree or to accommodate. Have we moved along that continuum since 2004, and is there now indeed a duty to accommodate?
The courts have always said there may be a duty to accommodate, where essentially where rights are proven, or where the likelihood of the right being proven is incredibly strong. But again, it's a moving target. I do think we are moving along slowly but surely. There have been a couple of events recently that I think have to move us into a realm of moving from a duty to accommodate to a duty to learn from one another.
Well, that's a wonderful quote from the head of the BC Supreme Court, I believe, that we have a duty to learn. And in his piece, he says, we don't have an anthropological background, historical background, we have a language barrier, we don't have the skills. He's speaking of judges. We don't have the skills to understand Aboriginal laws and customs and language and history, and we've got a duty to learn. And just within recent memory, the BC Law Society has mandated 50 hours of upgrading lawyers' skills on just that topic. That's kind of encouraging, isn't it?
Indeed, indeed. There are several encouraging things happening. Right? We have recently seen the UN pass the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which, among other things, declares that governments have a duty to seek the, quote, free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. Sure, that does, in fact, lots of talk about how that's not a veto. Well, the truth of the matter is, it gives the Indigenous peoples a veto.
Well, yes, it would if it were binding on Canada or affected Canadian law, and the government of Canada, in the aforementioned exhibit on how to consult, says that UN resolution doesn't.
And then the government has turned around and said they want to introduce legislation to make it so. And really, at heart, all that means is that you, as government, have to deal with an Indigenous veto if, to be blunt about this, you cannot be bothered bringing Indigenous peoples into the process and working with them to learn about their concerns and address them in an acceptable way.
Now, you've coined a great phrase as well, building on all that, and it is the duty to cooperate. Tell me about that.
Well, at heart, the duty to cooperate is an intergovernmental relations concept. In my career, I'm an old intergovernmental relations guy. I'm an old negotiator. If we understand, as we should, that Indigenous peoples are sovereign nations, that they've never renounced their sovereignty, nor had it legally taken from them, even though they agreed in treaties like the Peace and Friendship Treaties in the Maritimes to share their sovereignty with settlers' governments, our governments need to work with them in cooperation to make decisions together about issues that affect the Indigenous peoples, their traditional territories, their societies, because they are sovereigns and we are sharing sovereignty. We see this now both in BC's new environmental assessment legislation and in the new Federal Impact Assessment Act. In both those, we see some inklings that governments are recognizing that they need to move past duty to consult and begin to take seriously the idea that they have a duty to cooperate.
And if I'm paraphrasing a court ruling correctly, that doesn't mean you can say to Indigenous people, well, go off to the Environmental Assessment Review Board or the National Energy Board or some other adjudicative body and have your say like everybody else. That's not really exercising the duty to consult, because it has to be a somewhat unique process, or at least sensitive, doesn't it?
Indeed. I mean, last year the federal court found that the federal government's consultation process on the Trans Mountain Pipeline was inadequate in the William versus Canada case, because that's essentially what they did. The court said, look, folks, the reality is meaningful consultation isn't intended to simply allow Indigenous peoples to blow off steam and then let the government move on to whatever it intended to do anyway. The court concluded that the consultation process the federal government used fell short because, and I'm quoting the court here, Canada was required to do more than receive and understand the concerns of the Indigenous applicants. Canada was required to engage in a considered, meaningful, two-way dialogue. On the whole, the record does not disclose responsive, considered, and meaningful dialogue coming back from Canada in response to the concerns expressed by the Indigenous applicants. So two-way dialogue is a duty to cooperate.
Well, and am I too encouraged and too excited about the fact that the cabinet sent that back to the adjudicative body, reinvigorated its consultation process, and something like a year later, the federal court said, well, okay, you've now accomplished what you should have accomplished. So is that encouraging? How encouraged should I be on that?
It is encouraging. It's a learning process, and governments, especially big governments like our federal government, learn in kind of the way you turn the Queen Mary around, slowly. So yes, that's encouraging. We will see what happens in BC now with the Coastal GasLink protests. But hopefully the courts have served to create an openness to learning, to understanding how to cooperate by creating a credible threat to governments that if you don't get it right the first time, you're going to just delay things tremendously. And hopefully those of us around the intergovernmental relations, political science, legal community can have some, albeit probably small, effect on creating the relationship we need.
When we're talking about this arc and evolution that's been going on since 2004, I'm reminded of the late constitutional scholar Peter Hogg, who just died, who spoke of a dialogue between the Parliament and the Supreme Court about what laws mean. And I guess we're in that vigorous dialogue right now. One of the manifestations is that certain First Nations Aboriginal communities are protesting all across the country about activities in British Columbia. And I guess a lot of people might say, well, gee, isn't that weird? I think it's a dozen First Nations bands have agreed to the pipeline. Some haven't, a minority haven't, and then some thousands of miles away are protesting. And you say, you know, what up with that? When Mill said it's the greatest good for the greatest number, you've got more than 51% of the bands who are directly affected in favor of it. However, when you think of the disagreements we have among the provinces and municipalities and individual members, individual politicians across the country, other governments are equally fractured, aren't they?
Sure. What we've seen is politics. There are the Indian bands, now known as First Nations, are a creation of the Indian Act, federal legislation. And the Indian Act bands, band councils, have developed some legitimacy over the years as the voice for Indigenous peoples, but not complete legitimacy. And that's what's going on in BC. There are challenges to the legitimacy of who is government here. And frankly, that's not for white guys like you and me to determine. We need to create an environment in which Indigenous peoples themselves can figure out how they wish how they wish to be governed, who they wish to have voice for them. And I think that's what the protests across the country are really about. It's a message of Ottawa, don't tell us who speaks for us. Give us space to figure that out for ourselves.
Well, and then you have to amend the Indian Act because the minister has virtually plenary powers in that regard. But I think that's another interview. My consultation with you has been great. Thank you. I know I asked very long questions, but that was to give you a chance to go have a snack or pour a cup of coffee. But I think my consultation with you should end with whether you have any last words or something that you'd like to contribute that I forgot to ask you about.
Actually, interestingly, I do. A little bit of an aside. I think all of this comes together Um, I'm in Fredericton, as you mentioned, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about what we can do, how we can do this, how we can create a duty to cooperate out of what we have now next month here in Fredericton. The Mi'kmaq-Wolastoqey Center at the University of New Brunswick, with whom I have a relationship of many years, is hosting its 5th Peace and Friendship Treaty Days in Fredericton on March 12th and 13th. And interestingly, the theme for this year is "You Cannot Own Another Life Form," integrating Indigenous understandings of sharing into land and resource use decisions. Exactly what we've been talking about today. Our keynote speaker, and I'm really looking forward to this, on the evening of March 12th, is Thomas Berger. Tom is best known as chair of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry in the 1970s, an inquiry that was probably the first time Indigenous peoples were given real voice. Indigenous perspectives were taken seriously in resource development project decisions. I imagine we will learn a lot from Mr. Berger, who in the decades since the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry has continued to be involved in these debates as a lawyer, and as well from the panel discussion on March 13th with some really interesting, knowledgeable people from the Wolastoqey Nation, the University of New Brunswick's elder in residence, and others, about how we move from a duty to consult to a duty to cooperate. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion, because I think those are the sorts of discussions that we need to have as society, and we need to encourage our governments to have with Indigenous peoples if we want to make this right.
Fantastic, and what an opportunity to speak to really a living legend in history and an icon like Thomas Berger. I'm sure it's going to be stimulating, and I hope you come back and tell us about it. Thank you very much.
That would be lovely. Thank you very much.